Hi everybody, this is Bastian, and today we're going to take a look at how we can break through a pawn center with rooks. So let's take a look at the game I played. I'm playing white, and the game starts out with f4, so I'm playing the bird opening. Black continues with d5. I play knight with 3, which is the typical continuation. f6. So the point of this is to support the e5 pawn break. I play e3, typical bird continuation. Black goes for his pawn break with e5. And now I play b3, preparing to fianchetto the bishop on b2. And this move doesn't seem to make a lot of sense, because the typical bird continuation is to take on the pawn on e5. But white doesn't have to do so, but he has to be willing to play with a closed game, because now black can play e4 and kick away the knight. So b3 was played. Black indeed plays e4, and now my knight is under attack. So I play knight to d4. Black continues with c5, kicking the knight again, and I retreat with knight to e2. So we're seeing some sort of Alekhine type of play, where I am hoping to overextend black's rapid pawn advance. Black continues to harass my knight with bishop to g4, and I play h3. Now at this point, black has to make a choice, either to exchange the knight or retreat. And I think black was a little bit too aggressive in playing this move. So perhaps black was thinking on playing bishop to h5. But one of the main points of the bird system is to continue with a pawn push on the king side. So I would have had no issues with playing g4, after which the knight has to retreat anyways. So black has to make the choice to exchange or retreat. And if black exchanges with, say, bishop takes knight on e2, I can get in a little bit of free development, either with bishop takes or queen takes, and black will have lost the bishop pair. So black does not take on the knight on e2, and instead retreats to e6, still with a very solid position on both sides. I continue development with bishop to b2. Black develops with bishop to d6. I play the aggressive g4. And now black plays an interesting move, f5. Now, this bishop has been on a blunted diagonal since the start of the game, with pawns on e5, f6, and g7, with the bishop defending. But we can see that with black's overextended pawns, the diagonal has now become completely open. And indeed, it looks like we can grab a free pawn on g7 with the free rook on h8.
It's a trap!
It's a trap. Of course, white shouldn't take on g7 because my opponent has opened up a diagonal d8 h4 with an immediate attack on the king. So if I were to take on g7, which wasn't played, let's see what the continuation would be. If bishop takes pawn on g7, grabbing the pawn and later on grabbing a free rook, black would have continued with queen to h4 check. And the only defense would be knight to g3 forced. Queen takes knight on g3 check. So I'm already down a knight, but I have an escape square on e2. So king to e2 again forced. After which black may continue with pawn takes pawn on g4. And we can see that white's king is in a lot of trouble because all of the escapes are cut off, with black's aggressive pawn development. So if I were to take on, let's say, the rook on h8 at this point, so bishop takes rook on h8, we can see the danger with pawn takes pawn, and now bishop to g4 check will lead either to a checkmate or the loss of the queen. So once again we cannot take on the rook, and taking on the pawn on g7 would have been a mistake to begin with, leading to a lost game for white. Of course, this wasn't played, so let's go back. After the pawn push on f5, white has a few defenses. So one defense that I could have played would have been g5, continuing my own pawn push, which would block the queen check. After which perhaps h6 to try and clear that square, h4 to defend, pawn takes pawn, pawn recaptures, and we can see that the diagonal is still nicely blocked and there's no clear way for black to grab any of the pawns. So that's a valid defense, but it wasn't played, so let's go back. So after f5, an alternative defense, instead of g5, could have been knight to g3. And once again, we are blocking the immediate threat of queen to h4 check. If black were to continue queen to h4, which is best, attacking the rook, white could have made a defense with rook to g1. And we can see that both knight and pawn are still protected, and it's very difficult for black to continue his attack. So that's the second possible defense. So let's go back. This wasn't played. After pawn to f5, laying out the trap of bishop takes pawn on g7, I use a third kind of defense, which I call the spit in your face defense. Because I play pawn to d4. And with pawn to d4, I am willing to accept the queen to h4 check, but I'm also blocking black's trap with bishop takes pawn on g7 using my own pawns. So black is probably a little bit confused at this point, but he plays the best move, which is obviously queen to h4 check. But now we can see that after pawn to d4, I have created an escape square on d2. So there's a huge trade-off here, where I'm willing to forgo castle privileges and go on the run with my king. So unless I want to lose a rook with knight on g3, king to d2 is pretty much forced. Black continues his attack with pawn takes pawn, and of course the pawn cannot be recaptured because queen takes rook on h1. I grab a pawn on c5, so the material is once again equal. And now black has a choice. He can continue his attack with bishop takes pawn on c5, or he can retreat bishop to f8 in order to protect the g7 pawn, because once again the diagonal has become open, and now grabbing the pawn and rook becomes a real threat for black. So there are two attacks going on. Black decides to be aggressive and continue with his attack. So bishop takes pawn on c5, offering up, for real this time, the pawn and the rook. So I grab the pawn on g7, so the rook is basically lost. But black continues his attack with queen to f2. And we can see the threat of the attack. Either bishop takes on f3, check, or queen takes on e3, check, with no escape squares for white's king. So I have to bring my king to safety, and I play king to c1. Black grabs the pawn with the bishop, check, and again I need to flee with my king to d2. So black seems to get a lot of compensation from the sacrifice of his rook on h8. And my king has to flee all the way to b2, but at this point, this king is relatively safe. Now, I am blocking my own pieces on a1 and a little bit on b1, but the only way for black to continue his attack is to attack through the diagonal. And my bishop on g7 is not only a nice attacking piece, it's also doing a very great job to protect the diagonal on b2. And it will be very hard for black to get rid of my bishop. Still, black continues his attack. He takes on the pawn on f4. Bishop takes pawn on f4. Once again, grabbing a pawn in the attack. But this may have been a mistake, because I can simply exchange. Knight takes bishop, queen recaptures, and black has not enough pieces to continue his king hunt. Queen to e3 check will obviously fail because my bishop is protecting. So I can choose to either grab the pawn or the rook. But although grabbing the pawn is perfectly reasonable, I do not want to give black the opportunity to bring more pieces into the attack. Although, if I were to do so, pawn takes pawn, bishop recaptures, we can continue with queen takes pawn. And on the left side of the board, we can see a similar attack on the diagonal with queen takes pawn and an attack on the blocked rook on a8. So, after which black will lose both rooks. But I don't take on the pawn just yet because of the bishop. I play something else. First I grab the rook on h8, which is going to be played anyways. Black plays h5. Two clear purposes: adding support for the pawn on g4, and also black may retreat his queen to h6 in order to try and get rid of this bishop, which is stuck all the way on the board, but is very hard to reach at this point. And although unlikely to capture the bishop later in the game, black will actually be able to do so. I continue normal development, knight to c3, a logical developing move, adding a second attacker on the pawn on d5, and starting to develop my rook on a1. Black continues with knight to e7. I continue with knight to b5, looking to play knight to c7 in some cases with the triple fork. Although at this point, of course, the square is still covered by the queen. Black doesn't want any of this and kicks my knight immediately with a6. And I remaneuver my knight to d4. Still blocking the diagonal. But now we get an attack on the bishop on e6, with a second attack, next move, on the queen on f4. So black moves his bishop, and this is what I was waiting for, to take on the pawn on g4. So pawn takes pawn. There's no longer a defender on e6, so the bishop has moved. Pawn recaptures with a mild threat of pawn promotion. But rook to h4 prevents the pawn advance. There would be a discovered attack on the queen. And now we have two attackers on the pawn on g4. So this pawn is basically lost. And we can look at black's knight on f7. And there is no way for the bishop to come in and protect the pawn, because both squares are now covered. So the pawn is lost. Black continues development with knight to d7. I take on the pawn on g4 with the rook. And if I were to do so, let's go back with the queen. Black may have tried an exchange, but instead I choose the rook. And this almost forces the queen back to h6. But at this position, it is able to attack my bishop on h8. And we can see that there's only one square to go into safety. And my own knight that is overprotecting the diagonal is actually preventing the retreat of my own bishop. So at this point I can still play bishop to g7, which is covered by the rook. So again the queen needs to move, queen to h7, but still threatening the bishop on g7, which has no place to go to. And now I play a very nice developing move, which is queen to e2. And this is a multi-purpose move. Now, it allows for space to the development of the rook on a1. It also protects the bishop, the rook in some cases. I can, if I need to, play queen to g2 to add a battery or additional protection to the bishop. It also puts the queen adjacent to the king, which is still stuck in the center. But it also supports an attack or a defense for a rook sacrifice on e4. Black continues with rook to g6. And at this point, black thinks he has won my bishop, because there is no place for the bishop to go to. And we can see that this knight blocks my defender on g4. So this bishop looks lost, and after queen takes, black may threaten the knight on d4 with check and tempo on the king on b2. But what black didn't take into account is the rook sacrifice that I'm going to make. Rook takes pawn on e4 check. Now black has to respond to the check, and there are two ways for black to do so. Either he can block the e-file, or he can move his king. To d8. Now, if king to d8, I can crush through with rook to e8 check. If king flees to c7, we can grab a rook, so that's bad for black. Or if bishop recaptures rook, I can continue with knight to e6 check. Again, there's a choice to flee. If king to e7, knight to g5, discovered check, black will lose the queen. If king to c8, I can play the in-between move queen to d2, which will lead to queen to c3 check with a strong mating attack on the king on c8. So if, say, a random move b5, I can come in with the queen, check, let's say king to b7, queen to c7 checkmate. Or if another move would have been played, rook to a7, for instance, queen to c3 check, king to b8, queen to c7 check, king to a8, queen c8 check, forcing knight to block, leading to a nice smothered mate with knight to c7 checkmate. But of course, none of this was played, because after the rook crashing through the center, after rook takes pawn on e4, black does not block, which would waste the piece. But simply plays the obvious move. Pawn recaptures rook on e4. So I continue aggressively with queen takes pawn. So I'm grabbing my second pawn for the rook, but I'm gaining tempo with a check. And we can already see that I am threatening a third pawn for good measure with the discovered attack on the rook on a8. So what could black try? If he blocks the e-file at this point with knight d to e5, I can grab the minor piece, and it cannot be recaptured, because if knight grabs the piece on e5, we can see that he will lose his queen on h7. So that won't work. The move that was played was king to d8. I grab my third pawn on b7, attacking the rook. Now, what could black try at this point? He could try queen takes the bishop, gaining the minor piece, threatening the knight on d4, but the knight gives me one tempo against the check, blocking the diagonal, which makes the recapture of the bishop on g7 too slow, because I can continue with check of my own, queen takes a8 check, after which, for instance, king to c7, and after c3, adding additional protection for the knight, we can see that we are up 2 pawns and an exchange. Make that 3 pawns soon enough, which will lead to a losing game for black. So another move is fleeing to c7, e7, which is even worse, because I can bring the rook in with tempo. So this won't work, and grabbing the bishop on g7 is simply too slow. Black may try rook to c8 instead, saving the rook, after which I can come in with the bishop. Bishop takes, and we can see that we have renewed our threat on the rook on c8. And it is almost impossible to defend against it. You say knight to b6 to protect the rook. I can simply grab the defender and continue with tempo and checks, and the rook will still be lost. So that won't work. Another defense would be perhaps rook to c5, the only square that is not under attack, to save the rook, after which I can come in with bishop to f6 check, saving my bishop. And of course, the bishop cannot be recaptured. If knight takes bishop, we have queen b6 check with a triple fork, and after grabbing perhaps the knight on f7 after a defense, we can still continue the game with tempo. And at this point, we can see that the material is equal, with a 3-pawn advantage for white. But black is in a terrible position, and we can continue to attack the king, eventually gaining more pieces and mate threats. So that defense will also fail for black. So let's go back. The move that was played was queen to b7, attacking the rook. Grabbing the bishop is too slow. There is no defense against the loss of the rook. Black plays rook to b8 to counter the loss of the rook. But I play knight to c6 check. And this move will not only grab the rook, but also continues the tempo and the mating attack on black's king. So black is forced to play king to e8. At this point, I can grab the rook, but I develop the rook with my own rook with tempo, forcing black to play bishop to d5, knight to d5, excuse me. So what should we play now? Well, we can continue with the idea to grab the rook. Knight grabs rook on b8, and this leads to a mate threat with queen takes knight on d7, which cannot be recaptured because of the discovered attack on the king on e8. So that's one way to continue. But a second way, which was played, was simply to crash through the center once again with rook takes knight on e5. Black at this point plays knight takes rook, leading to the checkmate, but the only alternative would have been the losing bishop to e6, after which rook takes bishop check, forcing king to f7. Queen takes knight check, forcing king to g8. Queen to e8 check, forcing rook takes rook on e8. But now we can see there is no longer a piece on the e6 square, and we can bring our final piece into the attack. Bishop to c4 check, forcing rook to e6, and finally bishop takes e6 checkmate. And we note that the attack was so fast that black never had a chance to grab the bishop on c7 with check. And black simply underestimated the power of the rook crashing through the pawn center. So I hope this game showed you how to crash through the pawn center with rooks, but also on how to develop your own pieces in order to make this possible. Thank you for watching. Please leave a comment and have a great evening.